Hi, this is Binny Freedman from Yeshivat Orayta speaking for Mizrahi's Parsha project. We're in Parashat Metzora, which of course continues our discussion about the Metzora, mistakenly translated as a leper. We're going to call him a Metzora from the malady of Tzarat. The Gemara in Erchin suggests that the primary reason among the 7 reasons given for why a person contracts Tzarat is because they slander, they speak Lashon Hara. So it's interesting that although a lot of discussion happened last week in Parashat Tazria regarding sort of the process of the Kohen identifying that someone has tzarat, what you do about it, the person is actually not called a Metzora until this week's Parsha, right? Parashat Metzora opens up, Zot tiyeh Torata Metzora b'yom taharato. So it's interesting that only now is he actually called a Metzora, right? Mistakenly translated as leper. It's also interesting that he's only finally called a Metzora b'yom taharato, on the day he actually becomes pure. That's a little odd. And it's interesting to note that this is actually a rather rare phenomenon. Generally speaking, for example, a woman who is in Nida is described in the Torah as benidata, in her state of Nida, of impurity. She's not actually called a Nida in the Torah, right? This may well be because the Torah doesn't allow impurity to define the person. And this sort of raises an interesting question that I think is a not insignificant issue in today's world. In Pirkei Avot and Perek Aleph, there are 2 Mishnayot juxtaposed one next to the other, which scream out for an understanding. Rabbi Shua ben Parachia and Nita Harabeli, who both lived seemingly at the same time in the heyday of the Roman Empire during very difficult times for the Jewish people. Rabbi Shua ben Parachia says in Mishnah Vav, "Havedan kol adam l'kav zchut," you should assume the best about every person. Now, this is not an easy thing to do. You see me walking into a McDonald's and buying a cheeseburger. You have to assume that, God forbid, I have some terrible illness that can only be cured through eating cheeseburgers. Not only do you have to assume this, it has to be such a natural assumption that you just think it's amazing that I went right in to fulfill the mitzvah of v'chai behem, to fulfill, pikuach nefesh, to live according to Hashem's law. Very difficult to do, to assume the best about a person. The very next Mishnah, not somewhere off in the tractate of Chagiga or the Jerusalem Talmud, but almost the next Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, it says, right, Nitar Bailey points out, a person should distance himself from an evil neighbor. Well, obviously, if you're assuming the best about a person, how do you have an evil neighbor? Like, you should have no evil neighbors because you assume the best about them. So Shimshon Farlers gives a wonderful response. He says, look, Judaism isn't silly. Chazal understood, the rabbis understood, the Torah understood that there is evil in the world. But don't judge the person, judge the action. You can't define the totality of a person based on an action, right? Assume the best about a person and judge actions as appropriate or inappropriate. We live in an age where we love to label. We're different tribes. You're left-wing or you're right-wing. You're religious or you're secular. You're Haredi or Tzioni, right? And we love to put people in boxes, but life isn't that simple. Plenty of people walking around in this country with long black coats and beards who served and fought in Israel's wars. And there are plenty of people who, live in different places and their perspectives are not at all what their environment would suggest, right? It's interesting that a person gets described as a Metzora, right? The Metzora is what's called Tuma Habami Gufo. I think one of Pesachim describes there are 2 types of impurity. There's impurity that comes externally, like, for example, when you touch a dead body and you become Tamei Lamet, that's external to you. And then there are things which are internal, right? Like a seminal emission, which comes from inside a person. This is impurity that comes from the inside. And when it comes from inside of you, perhaps what the Torah is telling us by stating that a person is only called a Metzora b'yom taharato, that when you become a Metzora, when you become a slanderer, when you make mistakes, even when you do tshuva, they leave an impression on you. It's not quite the same. Perhaps during this period of time, when Israel is going through such difficult experiences, and we have so much work to do, we need to start seeing people as whole and as different, and respect the otherness in those around us, and judge people by their actions rather than the totality of their persona. B'ezrat Hashem, we should merit soon to see an end to the war, to see the hostages returned home, and the injured healed, and the families comforted, and the soldiers all returned safely back to their borders. Kol Tuv and Shabbat Shalom.